Carrie Lund. I'm the director of The Pursuit of History, the nonprofit that brings these History Camp discussions to you each week. Tonight we have with us Francis Gary Powers Jr. Gary is the founder and chairman emeritus of the Cold War Museum located at Vint Hill, Virginia. He is the chairman of the Presidential Advisory Committee for the Cold War Theme Study, which assists the National Park Service to identify historic Cold War sites for preservation. Gary consulted for a Steven Spielberg thriller, Bridge of Spies, about the 1962 spy exchange between KGB spy Rudolph Abel and CIA U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers Sr. He is the author of Letters from a Soviet Prison and Spy Pilot, which is the topic of our discussion tonight. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Gary.
All right, Carrie and Lee, thank you very much for having me on.
Well, Gary, it's so nice to meet you, and it's so rare that we have an opportunity to talk to someone who is so very closely associated with a major international event. So we're looking forward to all the insight that you'll shed. Why don't we start for folks and set the stage of what was going on, where we were in the Cold War at that time?
Well, sure. For the listening audience who may not be old enough to remember the Cold War, or in particular the U-2 incident, we really have to go back to World War II. The Allies, the Soviets, the Americans, we were fighting on the same side to defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan. We were victorious. But towards the end of the Cold War, our political ideologies started to butt heads. Communism with the Soviet Union, democracy, capitalism with America. It's like oil and water, it doesn't mix. So shortly after the end of World War II, we start to have these confrontations. The first big one was the Berlin Airlift. Happened in 1947, about 18 months. The Soviets had surrounded Berlin. It was in the eastern sector. The Allied forces did Operation Vittles and some other operations to supply the East Berliners, the West Berliners, with food, coal, and supplies. So that blockade, the Soviets tried to do a blockade. We were able to do the airlift. That was the first sign of the Cold War between the Soviets and the Americans. If you move forward a few years, 1950, we have the Korean War. We back North Korea, South Korea, Soviets, China back South Korea. All of a sudden, the Cold War seems to be getting hotter. 1952, President Eisenhower is elected our President of the United States. For us in America, we had elected a war hero, someone who helped to win World War II. I like Ike was the campaign slogan at the time. For us, we had elected a military leader, a hero, someone who was very popular in the United States. For the Soviets, when we elected General Eisenhower in 1952, they thought we had elected a warmonger, somebody who was going to start World War III. And you have to remember that a few years prior, back in 49, the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb. So in 1952, we were the superpowers. We both had nuclear capabilities. And this also contributed to the Cold War tensions between our two states. So back in 55, a few years after Khrushchev had become president, Eisenhower is now premier of the Soviet Union. They are to meet in Vienna, Austria, to discuss diplomatic relations. Eisenhower approaches Khrushchev and talks about the open skies policy. He wants to fly over the Soviet Union taking photographs. He will allow the Soviets to overfly America and take photographs. That way, each superpower will know what the other one is up to. They can determine and find out and verify that they're not preparing for surprise attack. So all of a sudden, Khrushchev says, no, niet, I do not want you pesky Americans overflying my country. Well, this was a concern to our military and political leaders in America. What is Khrushchev hiding? He doesn't want us to fly over the Soviet Union. He must be hiding something. He must be building up for a surprise attack. And along these lines, Khrushchev is saying, at this time, we have more missiles, we have more bombers, we can bury you. So with this rhetoric, Combined with his refusal to do an open skies policy, this led to the direct development of the U-2 spy plane, which is basically the conversation this evening.
That is extraordinarily helpful. So let's go then to the incident that we're going to focus on, the incident and the aftermath. May 1, 1960, what happened?
May 1st, 1960, after 4 years of successful missions flying the U-2 over the former Soviet Union and other foreign hostile countries, my dad is selected to do this May 1st mission that will fly from Peshawar, Pakistan, across the entire width of the Soviet Union to Bodø, Norway. It should take about 9 hours to fly, approximately 2,900 miles. The CIA wanted to photograph certain missile bases and other targets in preparation for the summit conference that was taking place on May 16th. They wanted to provide Eisenhower with as much information as possible so he will have the upper hand in the negotiations at the Paris Summit Conference. So my father is selected to do the May 1st mission. He gets up very early on May 1st, 6:30 a.m. He takes off. He crosses over the Soviet Union's border. He starts to flip on and off the camera switches that will take the photographic imagery of the ground below. Over the next 4.5 hours, he's flying at an altitude of 70,500 feet over the city of Sverdlovsk. There's a bright orange flash. Shockwave hits the plane, pushes the plane forward, throws Dad back in his seat. Dad realizes something's gone wrong. The controls no longer respond. You can't fly a plane without a tail section. The near miss of a Soviet SA-2 missile has exploded near enough to the tail section to cause structural failure. As a result, the plane falls out of the sky. He bails out. He's apprehended on the ground. He's turned over to Soviet authorities. They then turn him over, the local authorities in Sverdlovsk, turn him over to the KGB. The KGB interrogates him for 3 months. They do a show trial at the Hall of Columns in downtown Moscow. The verdict after the 3-day trial, 10 years imprisonment. Dad starts to serve this sentence in August of 60. He spends 18 months in Vladimir prison, a total of 21 months in captivity, prior to being exchanged for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel on February 10th of 1962. So that's a very condensed version of the overall U-2 incident. The fallout is that the summit conference planned for May 16th fell apart. Khrushchev got the upper hand. He was able to embarrass the United States by showing that we had been doing these spy flights. Eisenhower had been caught in a lie. He had said when the U-2 was shot down, once everything was being uncovered, that it was a weather research flight. Well, Khrushchev was able to prove with the living pilot and the trial that it was actually a CIA spy flight. So Khrushchev used this as maximum propaganda value to embarrass the United States and get the upper hand going forward.
There's several things there that we should dive into. One small thing, though, you said that your father was turning off and on the camera. Tell us a little bit about that. I just kind of assumed it was photographing the duration or something.
Well, it was a Hikon B camera. It was specifically developed through Kodak to take photographs of the ground from altitudes of 70,000 feet and above. You could see parking spaces, you could see the tanks, the missiles, the airplanes on the tarmac. They were able to count how many bombers the Soviets had, how many missiles the Soviets had. They were able to show and figure out the strengths and weaknesses of our adversaries through this photographic reconnaissance. The film was made of mylar. It was very tightly woven around the spools. The camera that's in the underneath the belly of the aircraft would go back and forth, taking either a panoramic photograph of the ground below or straight down a very detailed narrow line over specific targets. And this is how they were able to gather this information, the Americans.
Fascinating. And again, now, it was interesting to learn. knew of the shoot down, I didn't realize this was the first long mission that was going to go all the way across the Soviet Union. Now, again, just backing up for a minute, how long had flights been going on over some part of the Soviet Union?
The U-2 program was initially developed or thought of, conceived in 1955. It was built in 8 months under budget with a slide rule. Unbelievable by today's standards with computer technology and all the cost overruns that happen. The first successful mission took place over the Soviet Union on July 4th of 1956. I want to say Carmine Dito was the U-2 pilot for that mission. I may be mistaken. It's been a lot of years since I've used that name, but I think it's the correct one. And he flew over downtown Moscow, took photographs, came back. The Soviets, Khrushchev, went to the United Nations and complained. Well, the United States said, "What plane? We don't know what you're talking about. We're not flying over your country. Prove it." Well, they couldn't. And so it was a little bit of a frustration for Khrushchev to have these airplanes fly over his country. It shows that he could not defend his own country. And that was a very big embarrassment for Khrushchev in later years.
So could they tell based on radar? Was that how they were picking up? Okay.
Correct. In America, when we were testing the U-2, it was developed and tested at Area 51 in the Nevada desert. Our radar systems did not see the plane at 70,000 feet. So we thought, incorrectly, if we can't see it, the Soviets can't see it. Well, the Soviets' radars were better than ours. So they could actually pick up the U-2 flights across their territory. They would not follow it in a full, complete straight line. It would beep, they'd see something, it would disappear, it would beep again. They could track it, but not continuously per se. They would try to shoot it down. Their SA-1 missiles at the time would only go to 60,000 feet. This is why Kelly Johnson, the designer of the U-2 with Lockheed Skunk Works, designed the airplane to fly at 70,000 feet, 10,000 foot buffer between where the missiles were exploding and where the planes were flying. In addition, they tried to scramble MiGs to shoot down the planes. But the MiGs, MiG-15, MiG-17, could only go up to about 55 to 60,000 feet as well before their aerodynamics did not allow them to maintain level flight, and they'd fall out of the sky. So for the first 4 years, between July of 56 and May of 60, my dad did 27 successful missions. You combine that with the other 24 pilots, 25 times 25 is what, 225 missions or so over that 4-year time period.
That's fascinating.
And one other thing, detail. Not all the missions were over the Soviet Union. A great many of them were, but other missions occurred over China, Tibet, India, Pakistan, Middle Eastern countries, and Eastern European countries.
Okay. Well, talk to us about the captivity. Was your father tortured, or what sort of kind of duress and questioning and so forth did he go through?
Yes. The first 7 days of his interrogations, of his captivity, he was interrogated. Basically, 12-hour days, bright spotlight, grueling questions, threats of death, a Mutt and Jeff type of scenario for the 3 months he was in solitary confinement. But in particular, the first 7 days, Dad is lying to his captors outright, holding back as much information as possible, misleading them any way he can. But then on May 7th, international headlines around the world start to appear. So the KGB guard in charge of the interrogations, a copy of the New York Times in his hands, rushes into the interrogation chamber, shoves the newspaper in Dad's face, yells at him, "You've lied to us. You told us you were trained in Arizona. Well, the New York Times says you were trained in Nevada at Area 51. You might as well tell us everything. We'll get it out of your American press anyways." So all of a sudden, Dad is stuck between a rock and a hard place. If he tells the full truth, he's giving away secrets. If he lies to him, gets caught, he can get shot, face the death penalty for espionage. So for the next 3 months of solitary confinement and interrogation, my dad basically plays a cat and mouse game with his interrogators. He tells the full truth when he knows they can verify the information in the press. Gives them credibility. Lies to him outright when he knows there's no way they can find out the answer. Part truth, part lie, dances around a question when he has to do that. So this is how my father got through the interrogations for 3 months.
Extraordinary. What do you get a sense of what the Soviets were? What were they really after? I mean, they kind of had the most important thing right in front of them, right? Which is a pilot, proof that these flights have been going on and so forth. What else were they looking for?
The Soviets wanted the world to know that they were strong, they could defend their borders, that they were an equal to the United States. They did not want to be considered an inferior. And this is one of the reasons that Khrushchev was boasting and bragging about the missiles he had, that they were cranking missiles out like sausages, I think was one of his quotes, and how he was boasting about his bombers, that we are bigger, we're better, we're brighter, we're stronger, we're faster, we're better than you. So it was this Cold War mentality. The space race was a race to space. Who's going to win? Well, the Soviets got the first satellite, Sputnik, in orbit. We got the first man and the first astronaut, cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, to fly around on a solo capsule around the world. But we were able to get men to the moon first. So there was a space race competition between our two countries. It overplayed into the Olympics, the competition. The Miracle on Ice, 1980s, when the American hockey team won against the all-powering, all-dominating Soviet Russian hockey team. That was incredible for the United States to have won that match. Again, competition during this Cold War time period. We're better, we're stronger, we're bigger, we're faster, and it was this competition that fueled the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go to the trial. Tell us more about that. I believe his wife was able to come over. Is that correct? And had some attorneys and so on?
Yes. My dad's first wife, Barbara, was able to attend the trial on August 17th to August 20th of 1960. My dad's parents, Oliver and Ida Powers, were able to attend. They did have two attorneys. The Powers family, Ida and Oliver, had two attorneys with them that were provided to them by the Virginia Bar Association. Barbara Powers, Dad's first wife, had a doctor accompany her from her hometown of Milledgeville, Georgia. So the family was there. They were in the Hall of Columns up in the balcony watching the trial proceedings. International press and audience down below. Dad's in the docket on the stage, 3 judges behind him, prosecutor, defense team, back and forth. The prosecution is asking my dad questions. His defense counsel never once objected to any question that was asked. He basically sat there, nodded his head. Dad was on his own. I believe that the prosecution, the defense, and the judges were all in agreement as to what the sentence would be. That sentence was 10 years in prison. It was another way to embarrass the United States. They gave my father 10 years in prison because they are such a nice and hospitable country. They wanted the world to see how they treated the spies that they caught in their country. Unlike America, who had given the Rosenbergs the death penalty and gave Rudolf Abel, a Soviet spy captured in New York City in the late 50s, they gave him 30 years in prison. The Soviets gave my dad only 10 to show how nice they were. That was a public opinion, public relations maneuver to embarrass the United States and, again, make them look better.
Going back for just a minute to the original capture, what was your dad's expectation at that point? Was it, and it would seem perfectly reasonable that you'd be interrogated and then shot, potentially?
Right. So there were no formal, how do I want to say this, orders. There were orders that given to the pilots. They were told basically that, and I have to paraphrase, if capture appears imminent, you should maintain a cooperative attitude towards your captors. You're perfectly free to talk about your missions of taking photographs over foreign hostile territories. You should not mention anything about the equipment on board the airplane, the specifications about the airplane, and try to keep as much information as possible from them. But you can interact and talk to them. You are not to do the name, rank, and serial number. It was not a military mission at the time, and I have to get into that later. It was not a military mission at the time. It was a CIA civilian operation, espionage, covert operation. So these pilots were not military pilots. They were not under orders to give name, rank, and serial number. They were not under orders to commit suicide if captured. However, the pilots were given the option of taking a quote-unquote suicide device with them on these missions. It was explained to the pilots that if you're caught, you will be tortured. Here is a way to alleviate the pain and suffering. A small silver dollar, a hole drilled in the center, a small needle hidden inside, dipped in curare. One prick into the blood system, the pilot would die from lack of oxygen. The poison would shut down the central nervous system. So the pilots were given the option to take this device with them. It was an optional device to take and an optional device to use at their discretion in the event of torture. So my father on this particular mission had this device. When he's parachuting down to the ground, he's looking at it, going, this is a really bad hiding place. The first souvenir that some Russian's going to want is an American silver dollar. He takes the pin out. He throws the dollar away. It's in some cornfield in the Urals right now. He looks at the pin. He contemplates using it. He says, no, let's see what happens when I land. He sticks it in his flight suit pocket. He's apprehended. He's turned over to the KGB. On the third strip search, the KGB find the needle. My dad goes, oh, be very careful. He did not want to have a murder conviction on top of an espionage conviction. He is already in enough trouble. So the Soviets, the KGB, test this device on a dog. The dog dies in 20 seconds of asphyxiation. Khrushchev at his press conference comes up and goes, oh, look at these evil Americans. This is what they give their spy pilots to commit suicide with. This one wanted to live to see another day. And from that moment on, Dad had disobeyed orders. But again, optional device to take, optional device to use in the event of torture at the pilot's discretion. No official orders to take it, to use it one way or the other. Some pilots took it on missions, some pilots did not. Dad took it on some, Dad didn't take it on others. This particular flight being one of the longest ever attempted, he said, just in case something goes wrong, or I have a crash, I'm bleeding out, or I'm a mile or two from the border, I can use it as a weapon. So this is what I remember him telling me as to why he took it on that mission that day.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Was there some thinking about why this was CIA versus military? Is there some legalistic difference there?
Yes, and it's a very big difference. If it was a military plane with a military pilot flying over a foreign hostile country, that would be an act of war. Eisenhower did not want to provoke World War III with nuclear weapons. He wanted to gather intelligence. So by giving it to the CIA under Allen Dulles, who appointed Richard Bissell to run the program, it was a covert operation. It was espionage. It was not a military operation at the time. So this is 1950s. You have to jump forward now to 1998, a declassification conference hosted by the Air Force and the CIA at Fort McNair in downtown D.C. In 1998, this declassification conference showed that it was actually a military operation. But in 1998, it's been 8 years, 9 years since the fall, 7 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Cold War is over. They can now release this information that was a military operation. When that was unveiled, declassified, that opened up the door for my father to be publicly recognized by the United States government as a hero to our country. Up until that time, he was a civilian. Civilians are not entitled to military awards, the POW medal. And so in 1998, when this was declassified, that opened up the door for him to be honored by being awarded the POW medal in 2000, and ultimately the Silver Star in 2012. So the U.S. government in 1998 started to come up to the plate. They started to set the record straight. They helped to dispel the misinformation of the time. We can go over that in a minute. And they honored Dad as a hero to our country. But it was all because enough time had passed, the Cold War was over, that could finally be revealed.
Yeah. You know, we should mention, and perhaps I should have started out this way. Thank you to your father for his service to the country.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. He does too.
How was it? So you explained that the earlier understanding or explanation was it was CIA, and then later revealed it was a military operation. Tell us a little more about what happened there.
Well, back in the 55 era, when the U-2 program was being developed, Eisenhower is adamant. He does not want it to be an Air Force pilot. He does not want it to be an Air Force operation, no military involved. He does not want to risk starting World War III. So he hands the program over to Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, to run it as a covert operation. General LeMay, the U.S. Air Force top general, said, hey, it's an airplane. It should be in our arsenal. It should be controlled by the Air Force. So there was a bit of a contest. That's not the right word. There was a bit of a butting of heads between the U.S. Air Force and the CIA as to who would control this program. But under Eisenhower's direct orders, it was handed off to the CIA, so it would be a civilian operation, not a military one. So that's the background as to why the CIA headed it up. Today, the U-2s are still flying. It is in the Air Force's arsenal. The location out in California, Beale Air Force Base, is the headquarters for the U-2 program, and they operate around the world every day of the year. Fascinating.
So let's go to this declassification and so forth. Was this a public conference, it sounds like, with the expectation? Was it essentially revealing these things, or was it an internal kind of agency discussion or intergovernmental discussion about what gets declassified?
Right. It was not a public conference per se. You had to have been invited, but people in the industry, Lockheed Martin, Kodak, Air Force, CIA, and other members or representatives were at this conference, including the family members of some of the pilots and the pilots themselves. So it was a big unveiling to finally be able to recognize the pilots, their families, the crews, the sacrifices that were made, the people who died in support of this program between 55 and 75. So it was basically the way that the government was finally able to reveal and get out into the public domain some of the history, up till then classified history, that finally enough years had passed, they could finally come out and say that the plane on May 1st was shot down at 70,500 feet. That's when that altitude was finally revealed for the first time. They were able to say that it was a military operation because enough time had passed, the Cold War is over, the Soviet Union no longer exists, so they could say it was a military operation. They were able to go in and even show some of the ramifications of how the shoot down, imprisonment, public opinion at home in America affected my father negatively. His reputation was tarnished as a result. And it goes through that process of how that occurred because of the lack of support the pilots had. They weren't trained on what to do if captured. They were on their own. As a direct result of the U-2 incident, my father's interrogations and ultimate exchange, the CIA then started to train their pilots better, interview family members, their wives in particular, to make sure that nothing would damage the relationship going forward, that they weren't a detriment to the program.
Sure.
My dad's first wife, Barbara, was somewhat of a spectacle, and oftentimes could have been in very embarrassing situations had the press decided to publish photographs that they had taken. Mm-hmm. So the CIA was able to learn from this and then help to improve the recruiting process as well as the orders that were given going forward for missions in their field. And the Air Force, the same thing. They were able to take this as a learning example and to make improvements into their programs when all of a sudden someone was captured behind enemy lines, like Scott Grady back 20 years ago or so.
Well, let's go back to the trial and the verdict, and then play that forward from us in terms of when there's ultimately the exchange.
And let me say one more thing before I go into that topic. For the listeners who would like to find out more, the viewers who would like to find out more about this declassification conference, you can Google it, and you can find the actual proceeding documents that are declassified to read what was revealed. You have to search for GW, which is George Washington University, NSA, not the security agency, but the National Security Archives. So you search for GW, NSA, and Secret U-2. It'll be the first thing that pops up, Secret History of the U-2, and in that web page is the documents of the proceedings of that declassification conference. So I figured your listeners or our audience would like to know that.
That's great. Maybe we can put that in the notes below too also.
Great. And if you could repeat the question in regards to the trial and some other stuff, please.
So the trial takes place, there's the verdict, and then what ultimately leads to the exchange, what happens during the time between the verdict being passed and that exchange and so forth.
Got it. Between August of 1960, August 17th, August 20th is the trial. The sentence is 10 years in prison. Dad starts to serve that sentence in Vladimir prison. While he is in captivity, the Soviets allow him to write letters home to his family. During his interrogation, the first 3 months in Lubyanka prison, the KGB prison, he is, I thought his letters were never censored. But then I listened to his audio tapes, and I find out that they actually were censored. The Soviets allowed him to write home, again, showing how hospitable they were, how nice they were. This prisoner can write letters home to his family. Rudolf Abel, the Soviet spy that was captured in 1958, ultimately exchanged for my dad, was not allowed to write letters home to his family. Again, another jab, showing how nice they were, how hospitable they were, and how evil the Americans were. Purely propaganda. So my dad was able to write letters home to his family. In 2017, I published this book, self-published, Letters from a Soviet Prison. It's Dad's personal correspondence, private correspondence, and personal journal that he had while in prison. Now, the first 3 months of letters I thought were not censored, but I find out they were. The Soviets would allow him to write the letter. He'd write the first one. They would review it. Change this paragraph, move this sentence, take this out, move this here, put that there, rewrite the letter. The second draft. They review it. Take this out, put this here, move that there, rewrite the letter. So the third or the fourth draft would go home to his parents, looking as if it had not been censored in any way. And I discovered that it wasn't because they were fearful my father was going to say something. They were trying to disrupt any type of a code that he was trying to insert in a letter home. And the pilots were taught a basic code, A equals B, B equals C. You can use the different letters and do something, or the second letter of each word in a sentence would be a word. You can do a basic code, but it takes time to set it up. And my father was never alone or never comfortable enough to try to set it up, thinking that someone was watching him 24 hours a day to set up a code to try to get a message home. So that was what was going on in Lubyanka prison for the first 3 months. The next 18 months from August 20th to February 10th of 62, Dad is in Vladimir prison with a cellmate. The cellmate, the Latvian. He talks to my dad about what he had done, basically smuggling goods and people in and out of Latvia while working for the British. Neither individual talked a lot about their missions and the details of what they did, but they did discuss being shot down, being in prison, what it was like. I mean, just basic conversation. So my father and Zergard, that's the guy's name, they did become friends while in prison. Zergard taught my father to play chess. He taught my dad to weave rugs on burlap potato sacks to pass the time. He taught Dad a few Russian phrases and sentences and try to communicate a bit in Russian or to understand some basic things. And they basically helped each other endure the hardship. But then one day, I don't know, a month or two into the incarceration, the cellmate stay, they're playing chess. My dad has basically been taught to play by Zergard. He can move the pieces. He understands some of the strategy. He understands how to maneuver, and he knows how to play a game now. So Zergard does the following. He sets up the chessboard. He turns around. He blindfolds himself. He still beats my dad at chess. Brilliant guy. So smart, my dad's now thinking, he remembers everything I say. He must be a plant. And for the most part, we do believe he was a plant. We think that through the research that some colleagues have done, that he actually was captured working for Latvia, smuggling goods and people through the underground, through the resistance. And that after he was caught, he copped a deal for lenient treatment in exchange for reporting on his cellmates. And the fact that we think this is Zergard was with 3 or 4 other high-profile prisoners prior to being with Dad.
Fascinating.
He was also released a few months after my father was exchanged in February 62. Sometime later in 62, he goes home. And my colleague who was doing this research basically said he had to check in with his KGB handler once per month. So I don't have the documentation to prove this, but it is something I believe that he was a plant.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So what was the reception that your father received when he came back to this country?
While my father was incarcerated for those 21 months, there were many editorials in the newspaper. Politicians and even military people, armchair generals. Oh, he should have done this. Oh, he should have done that. Oh, why didn't he do this? Oh, he's a traitor to our country. All this misinformation, fake news of the time, was being circulated when my father was incarcerated. Things such as he defected. He landed the plane intact. He spilled his guts and told the Soviets everything he knew, or he hadn't followed orders and committed suicide. So all of this rumor, speculation, misinformation was being circulated around. When Dad comes home, he is extensively debriefed by the CIA at a safe house in Maryland for 3 weeks. During those debriefings, they realized, the CIA, Dad did everything he was supposed to do. He followed his orders to a T. He did not reveal any sensitive information to the enemy, and he did everything he was told to do. He was cleared by the CIA. He then appears before a Senate Select Committee hearing March 6th of 62. Prescott Bush, President Bush's father and grandfather, Barry Goldwater, Dick Russell, Senator Albert Gore Sr. are some of the committee members that were on this committee that reviewed this case. They wanted to get to the bottom of the U-2 incident. All this news, how did this pilot get captured? Oh, the Soviets can't shoot down that plane. They don't have that missile. Had to be the pilot's fault. We have to get to the bottom of this. So they interview him, question and answers, deliberation, 8 hours at a committee hearing. At the end of the committee hearing, the senators give my father a standing ovation. They show him to be a fine young man, performing well under dangerous circumstances. Basically a pat on his back, good job for your country. So he's been cleared by the CIA, he's been cleared by the Senate, but because of the negative press, he's not yet been cleared by the court of public opinion. and his reputation was tarnished as a result of the incident. He did everything he was supposed to do. President Kennedy had even authorized him to meet with him on March 6th after the Senate Select Committee hearing. But President's brother, Bobby Kennedy, said, "Oh, Mr. President, you don't want to meet with Gary Powers. You don't know how this Senate hearing is going to turn out. I believe he's a traitor to our country. You don't want to associate with him." So that meeting was canceled, snubbed by the President of the United States. So this just added to the tarnishing of my dad's reputation. And again, at the time, I kind of understand why everything happened the way it did. It's the middle of the Cold War. We are in this competition with the Soviets. It was easier to blame the pilot than it was to have to admit the Soviets were more advanced than we were in missile and radar technology. So it was easier to blame the pilot than to be embarrassed by being behind the Soviets. So I believe that is what contributed to Dad's tarnishing of the reputation. Dad was the type of individual, however, this did not affect him. Yes, he wishes that the U.S. government at the time would have stepped up to the plate and helped to set the record straight and clear his name even more so than CIA and the Senate Select Committee. He really wishes that they had gone the extra effort and helped to squelch the misinformation, the bad press, but they did not do that at the time. It took them, 40 years, 1998, declassification conference, when that finally was revealed. And that's when they could finally award Dad and honor him as a hero to the country.
So Gary, this has been very interesting. I want to take a minute and go to some of the work that you've done in addition to writing the books and speaking with respect to the Cold War. And the introduction, Gary mentioned the museum. You want to talk a little bit about that, perhaps the background of the museum, your role, and the status of the museum today?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Back in '92, I moved to Virginia from California. I'm coming out to George Mason University. I'm doing a graduate degree in public administration, nonprofit management. Start to give lectures to high school students in Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. area. 9 times out of 10, I'd walk into a classroom, give a talk on the U-2 incident. I get blank stares from the kids. This is 1994, 95. The students think I'm coming into a history class, sometimes an AP history class, to talk about the U-2 incident. They know nothing about it. They think it has something to do with the U-2 rock band. So all of a sudden, I realized we have to do something to preserve Cold War history. 1996, I found the Cold War Museum to honor Cold War veterans, preserve Cold War history, educate kids on this time period. What I thought would take 3 years, fundraise $3 million, shouldn't be too hard to do, took 15 years to get brick and mortar. And in that time period, we started to collect Cold War items. Very easy to find in the mid-90s, very hard to find today. So we were ahead of the curve when we started going out to different groups and organizations and military veterans and even eBay at the time to find Cold War related items and artifacts. We have one of the largest collections of civil defense items in the United States, having saved and salvaged the Civil Defense headquarters for Washington, D.C. We have items from the former Eastern Bloc countries, flags, banners, regalia, uniforms, some weapons. We have a SA-2 missile, the type that shot down my father, also the type that were in Cuba that helped spark the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have just a whole hodgepodge and a eclectic collection of Cold War items from 45 to 91. One of the most interesting items, two of the most interesting items, a mailbox, U.S. Postal Service mailbox from Georgetown, Washington, D.C. It's on display at the International Spy Museum on loan from the Cold War Museum. It was used by Aldrich Ames, a piece of chalk across the side of the mailbox, to signal his KGB handler that he was ready for a pickup or a drop-off. So that's a very unique item. We have a Stasi prison door from the infamous Hohenhausen underground, nicknamed the U-boat prison facility from East Berlin. And we have Mao's ear. So General Mao, China, he would come out in the 40s and 50s. He would be talking. And so the CIA made a plaster Paris model of his ear. Earlobes, like fingerprints, are unique to each individual. So this is a way the CIA could monitor Mao when he's in public to see if it was actually him or his body double that was filling in. So these are the type of things that we have on display and or loan through the Cold War Museum. More information online at coldwar.org. They are opened on the weekends. They are located at Vint Hill Farms Station, 45 miles west of Washington, D.C. It's an authentic Cold War historic site used by NSA, CIA, ASA, Army Security Agency, and other groups to monitor electronic communications, basically eavesdropping through signals intelligence or electronic intelligence to monitor the Washington, D.C. embassies, 45 miles away, or international signals from around the world. For whatever reason, that location in Virginia is a receiver, and it attracts all these different radio waves and signals and electronic communications where they were able to intercept, decode, transcribe, and listen in around the world. That base has been closed now. It's no longer a government facility. There's a museum, our museum, a winery, a brewery. We're right in between the two. Great place to be. There is a school nearby. There are homes, apartments, a big field for demonstrations, a community theater. FAA has a hub monitoring air traffic control that's there. And there are a few government contractors in the commercial section. So 45 miles west of Washington, D.C., opened on the weekends. More information, coldwar.org.
Excellent. And we'll put that in the chat and the links and so forth too. Well, Gary, this has been very interesting. Thank you for all you've done to educate people, both through the books and speaking and now through the museum. Carrie, do we have some questions?
We do. All right. We have a viewer who would like to know a little bit more about the U-2 plane. When that was captured, I assume it was captured, it was not totally destroyed when it was shot down. Were they able to get technology that the U.S. did not want them to have?
So the U-2 basically looks like that. That is the U-2 spy plane. This is the cover of my dad's book, Operation Overflight, that he wrote in 1970. So this airplane is basically, I got to do this backwards, a 80-foot wingspan, a 40-foot fuselage. It's basically a glider with an engine. It could soar at altitudes of 70 to 75,000 feet for on operational missions. And it was designed by Kelly Johnson, the lead designer of Lockheed Skunk Works. Kelly Johnson also developed and designed Amelia Earhart's plane that she flew, the Shooting Star, the SR-71, and Skunk Works went on to develop the F-117 Stealth. So Skunk Works is a long aviation aeronautical history of spy planes and stealth aircraft. So 40-foot fuselage, 80-foot wingspan, flying up at 70+ thousand feet, anywhere from 5 to a maximum of about 9 to 10 hours. The photographs that it would take, you could see parking spaces, you could see the missiles, the tanks, the tarmac, the bombers and the MiGs on the ground. So it was a very good, useful platform to gather intelligence, photographic intelligence, for our CIA analysts to analyze, find out the strengths and weaknesses of our adversaries. When Dad's plane was shot down, the Soviets gathered the wreckage. They put it on display in Gorky Park. They went through it with a fine-tooth comb. I'm sure they tried to reverse engineer some aspects of it. On one trip to Moscow back, I want to say in 1997, my second time there, I saw what I thought was my dad's flight suit, the U-2 pressure suit, on display in the museum. So I went up to it and I'm looking at it, and it wasn't my dad's pressure suit. It was a MiG pilot's pressure suit, but it looked identical to my dad's. So I'm thinking they reversed engineered and got some of these ideas for this pressure suit from my father's. As far as the designing another type of plane, sometime in the mid 80s or the mid 90s, I've forgotten which decade, the Soviets and or Russia unveiled their high-altitude weather research plane? Well, it looked just like that in the front, but the tail section was a split tail. So it had two tail sections coming out the back. And they said it was their high-altitude weather research plane. There are some photographs of it around somewhere. I do even believe it's used in one of the kids' Call of Duty video games nowadays, where they actually reference the U-2 type plane that was produced by the Soviets and or the Russians. So I do believe they tried to reverse engineer as much as they could.
Okay, great. And if U-2s are still flying under the Air Force, why are those flights not considered an act of war?
Very good question. For the most part, today's flights, you are at 70,000 feet, you're 12 or 13 miles above. You're not over the country, you're flying along the border. And when you tilt a little bit, you can take a photograph 13 miles in. So technically, you're not flying over enemy airspace. Satellites today do the same thing. They are always flying around in a certain orbit, taking photographs or sending radio information or gathering information, whatever it is, relaying information. Satellites go in one particular orbit. If there's a problem over here, it's going to take a few days to reposition the satellite to finally be able to take photos on this side of the world. A U-2 can be anywhere in the world within 3 to 4 hours. So that's one of the reasons it's still operational today. It flies missions in conjunction with other UAVs and other drones. So it's not just the U-2 doing a particular mission. It could be supported by other aircraft at different altitudes, at different locations, trying to gather as much information as possible.
Okay, fantastic. Well, this has just been great. Thank you so much, Gary, for joining us and sharing this information with us. We all learned a lot tonight.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And more information, if you want to get in touch with me or your viewers, GaryPowers.com. You will see a list under my events of all the locations I'll be lecturing this year and next year. If you ever know of another venue, please keep me in mind. Thank you very much for having me on tonight.
Perfect. Absolutely. And we have a link in to Gary's website in the chat, as well as links to some of the museums he talked about and the GW, George Washington, for the U-2 incident information. Gary, did you have another?
You mentioned museums. I'd be remiss if I did not mention that I'm a board member of the Strategic Air Command Museum in Nebraska, another Cold War museum, the founder of the Cold War Museum, of course, but also an honorary member of the International Spy Museum in DC. And those three museums are great. You should really go to visit if you haven't already. Make plans to visit these museums if you like the Cold War and or espionage. They're great museums. I highly promote them and market them and endorse them where I go.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And next week, July 22nd, we will have Stephen McGinty with us, and he is going to talk to us about the world's deepest submarine rescue that took the combined efforts of rescue teams from Britain, America, and Canada in 1973. It is a great adventure story and a piece of history you may not know about. So we hope you will join us and have a good night. Thank you.
Good night.